Welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into one of the most intense moments of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days in October 1962, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. We'll explore this gripping story from both the American and Soviet perspectives, revealing how close we came to catastrophe and how diplomacy ultimately triumphed. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a nuclear standoff background and buildup. The seeds of the Cuban Missile Crisis were sown in the early 1960s. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Fidel Castro's Cuba felt vulnerable to further U.S. aggression. Seeking protection, Castro turned to the Soviet Union. Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity, not only to defend Cuba, but also to level the playing field in the nuclear arms race with the United States. In July 1962, Khrushchev and Castro secretly agreed to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. This move was intended to deter any future invasion attempts by the U.S. and demonstrate Soviet strength. Discovery and initial reactions. On October 14, 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy was informed 2 days later, marking the beginning of an intense period known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy convened a group of his closest advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to discuss potential responses. Options ranged from diplomatic negotiations to a full-scale invasion of Cuba. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation, announcing a naval blockade, or quarantine, of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment. He demanded that Khrushchev dismantle and remove all offensive weapons from Cuba. The Soviet perspective. From Moscow's viewpoint, placing missiles in Cuba was a defensive act. Khrushchev believed that by doing so, he could protect his ally Castro and challenge American dominance in nuclear capabilities. The Soviets were also concerned about U.S. missiles stationed in Turkey, which posed a direct threat to them. When Kennedy announced the quarantine, Khrushchev faced a dilemma. He could either escalate tensions or seek a diplomatic solution. Initially, he sent conflicting messages, one offering a peaceful resolution and another demanding U.S. concessions. The tense standoff. The world watched anxiously as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line established by the U.S. Navy. Would they stop or attempt to breach it? On October 24th, some Soviet ships turned back, but others continued toward Cuba, heightening tensions. The crisis reached its peak on October 27th, often referred to as Black Saturday. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. This incident brought both superpowers perilously close to war. Simultaneously, another U-2 plane inadvertently strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly provoking an armed response from Soviet forces. These events underscored how easily misunderstandings could lead to nuclear conflict. Negotiation and resolution. Amidst this tension, back-channel communications between Washington and Moscow intensified. Attorney General Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin on October 27th. He conveyed an offer. If the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, the U.S. would quietly dismantle its Jupiter missiles in Turkey at a later date. On October 28th, Khrushchev publicly announced that Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. This agreement effectively ended the crisis. Aftermath and legacy. The Cuban Missile Crisis had profound effects on international relations and Cold War dynamics. It led to improved communication between Washington and Moscow with the establishment of a direct hotline between the two capitals. The crisis also prompted both superpowers to reconsider their nuclear strategies and eventually led to arms control agreements like the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. For Kennedy, successfully navigating this crisis without resorting to war was one of his greatest achievements as president. For Khrushchev, although he managed to avoid nuclear conflict, his perceived retreat contributed to his political downfall 2 years later. Conclusion. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a powerful reminder of how close humanity came to nuclear annihilation, and how diplomacy can avert disaster, even in dire circumstances. Thank you for joining us today as we explored this pivotal moment in history from both sides. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into historical events that shaped our world.